Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our Business One Q&A Cafe. Today we have Alex Waddell presenting creating user-defined fields in Business One, so we'll look forward to that. Next week, we're completely off because we have Canada Day on the Wednesday, and we have Independence Day on the Saturday, so some of our employees are taking, time off next week. So we'll be out for all Q&A Cafes, but we'll be back for our next Business One session on July 9th. So it's Thursday, July 9th, same time. It's tour of browser access with Business One. So we'll look forward to that. We are recording the session. It will be sent out to everyone about 2 days after this, as well as information on how to register for the next Business One session. So without further ado, I will mute myself and I'll hand it over to Alex.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So welcome everybody. My name is Alex Waddell, and Business One for many years, mostly finance background, here to show you something not finance. It's really around user-defined fields. So these are additional fields that you can generate in the system. They actually get appended to the underlying database as new data sets. And then those fields are something which you can ultimately report on, or even manipulate in other ways if we're doing sort of advanced software development on your environment. So what we're going to cover today is just sort of how to create the various different flavors of user-defined fields. And we'll start maybe by looking at where those fields are actually located. So there's really, at the highest level, when it comes to user-defined fields, there's sort of two different levels, and that can be at the header record. So you can see here, if I open up a business partner, there's a panel on the right side of my screen, which called UDF. So that's short for user-defined fields. If this panel is not visible or not appearing, it may be collapsed. If you're not seeing it all, you can go to your view window and just toggle that off and on. So right now it's toggled off. If I go to view, user-defined fields, that is how I turn it on again. And then by default, it is collapsed. And from here, you can expand it. So when creating header level user-defined fields, so by header, I mean this is associated with the business partner in this particular case. All through the system, you can create user-defined fields on different levels. I will show you that. But when it comes to the header information, the panel will always be off to the right. In the case where you create a user-defined field in the row information, so a very common example of that would be inside a marketing document. And by marketing document, I mean a purchase order, an AP invoice, a sales quote, a customer invoice, etc. So if you want to create an additional field inside this grid, that's considered a row level user-defined field. And in that case, while the mechanics of creating the field are the same, the experience for your users is going to be very different because the field is going to be actually embedded inside this grid, allowing you to set custom data at each row level of the document versus at the header level. But be aware that you can create header level information on your marketing documents as well. So if I were to go in here and say view user-defined fields on my purchase order, I can invoke the panel here, and I could also have information at the header. So that's the very first thing you'll want to consider when you're trying to design user-defined fields. Where is it that I want to capture this additional data? Does the data relate to the purchase order in general, or does the data relate to the specific rows inside the purchase order? So knowing that will guide you on where you're going to create this user-defined field. So for us right now, when we open this panel, they're blank because this environment does not have any user-defined field. So we're going to create one from scratch. So to do that, you don't need to be inside any particular screen or form. You're going to determine that when you open up the tool for building. So underneath that, it's under tools and it's under customization tools. And you're going to see that there is a couple of different user-defined elements that you can set up. So in addition to user-defined fields, you could have user-defined tables. We won't be covering that today. We could do a different session on that if that's something you're interested in. A user-defined table means that you want to construct your own custom grid inside the system that's independent of any of the other database tables. And so that could be useful in a number of different ways. So let's say you wanted to create something that maybe tracked, I don't know, some sort of sales commission data or something like that. So something where you needed some data, it related to data inside your ERP system, but really what you needed was multiple columns in a table structure. And then from there, you could pull that information either into reports or start linking it into user-defined fields. So at some point in the future, we can do a session on that. And then user-defined values. In a few weeks, we will be doing a session on this. This is also known as formatted searches. And that allows you to create, impact the way, modify the way the behavior of certain fields are that already exist in the system. So not necessarily user-defined fields, but standard fields. You could invoke special characteristics, like for the field to auto-populate, or for the field to be a drop-down field instead of a free key field, things like that. So if you are interested in that, please check our calendar for the Q&A and you'll see sessions coming up for that particular subject matter. So with that, let's go in and have a look at how to create a user-defined fields. And I've mentioned this in past sessions, but feel free as you think of questions to just drop them in the question panel inside the GoToMeeting. I will be glancing over at that every so often. If I don't answer your question right away, I'll be sure to go through them all before we close off today. But if you think of questions, feel free to drop them in as we go. So once I've invoked the user-defined field, the management screen comes up, and this tells me all the various categories in which I can create user-defined fields. And this is fairly comprehensive, so there's very few places in the system that you cannot create a user-defined field. So you will see that, for example, in your inventory table, you could create one. You could create user-defined fields to augment fixed assets as part of project management, landed costs, production, payments. So all of these, but really the very two at the top, chances are 80% of your needs will be inside one of those two. So master data is a long list of sub-tables underneath this category. And I would say without fail, like business partner is a very common place where we want to create user-defined fields. So perhaps there's additional information you want to capture about your customers or vendors where there is not already a field in place. And so this is a very straightforward place, and that's where we'll do an example of right now. But in addition to that, you do have all of these other elements that are considered master data. So master data is anything that's non-transactional. It's a record that you would create in the system, and very likely it's going to be transacted against, and it will become permanent. So for example, you could create something on GL accounts, you could create additional information on your item groups, but typically in here, business partner is a very common scenario. So now you've determined whether your data, well, where you want your data, whether it's header level or row level. Let's get into what's involved in creating the field. So one thing to be aware of is this does trigger an update to the database table. You're going to get a request or a notification that there are connections to the server that could possibly be disrupted. So my advice would be to do this work after hours, just in case you do interrupt anybody who's in the middle of performing a transaction. If you do it during hours and you interrupt the transaction, they could lose their work. Typically, the way it manifests is they just get a disconnection error that the system's been disconnected for a moment, and then they'll be back online, but they may have lost whatever screen they're working on. Yeah, the question, if I change any of these settings, is it only for my computer or for all users? This is for everybody. So thank you for asking that. I should have made that clear. This is definitely something that you are doing as an administrator in the system. And it's something you probably want to put some thought into because you're impacting the way the system behaves for everybody. It's not just for you. It's not for you to capture extra data. And typically, I wouldn't expect for you to be able to go to tools and customization tools unless you have fairly deep access into the system, meaning that you are like a system administrator level in the system. So that's typically what it is. So if today you are not one of those people and you do have access to that, probably don't try and do this as I'm doing it, because you will impact unless you're on a test environment. You would want to work with your, I guess, entire team and your stakeholders in your various departments to make sure that whatever you're designing as user-defined fields are meaningful to the whole organization. And it's a bit of a project. And once you are live in the system, that's also something you have to consider, because if you are augmenting data to fields, to tables that already have records in them, you want to consider what is the impact to all the previous records that have been put into the system where nobody had the ability to put that data in, and how are you going to handle that? So those are the types of things that may turn this into a bit more of a project than a simple exercise like I'm doing now. So let's go ahead and create one. If you're in a test environment, you have all sorts of freedom. So I am doing this recklessly in a way that you wouldn't. But we will create a, so maybe let's just create a category field. And so you have two different things. The description is what shows up on the display panel. You can make this a little bit longer if you want. For your title, this is going to be permanent once you save this user-defined field. It shouldn't have any spaces in it, and you'll see why in a moment, because the system is going to do a modification of this name at the data level. And then the next thing you're going to want to consider is what type of data field are you creating? So what is it that you want to store in this data? The simplest one is alphanumeric, because that lets you put in any sort of text that also has numbers in it, but it does not enforce numericness. So that means that if your expectation is that people be entering numbers and not letters, you're going to want to set it to be numeric. If your expectation is this field is going to capture some information that relates to the aspect of time, you're going to want to choose this option, and then it's going to apply the proper format masks so that people can only enter date information into that field. More sophisticated than numeric is units and totals. So numeric is just natural whole numbers. So this might be good for creating a field where you want to create some sort of a identification that's numeric, but it doesn't have decimals or anything like that. If you are wanting to do things that are capturing dollar signs, decimals, percentages, stuff like that, then you're going to use this one. And then you also have one for general, which allows you to do attachments in the system. If you want to create a user-defined field where the user is expected to upload a document or a link to a document on a server somewhere. And you will notice that depending which one you select will impact the way these fields down here go. So for example, if I do units in total, it's going to want me for a subcategory. So what kind of units and totals? Do you want rates? Do you want amounts, prices, and quantities? This can be important because the decimal precision on these is dictated by your system configuration. So in your administration system settings, you have to determine what is the decimal precision on each of these different types of units. So typically amounts are dollars or to 2 decimal places, but rates could potentially be to a higher precision. Even prices, sometimes I'll see that if people are working in complex units of measures, they may be quoting or selling things with prices that go into half pennies and things like that. So do keep that in mind, because that's going to impact the behavior of that field as well. For now, let's just go and create one and we'll see how it works. So we're going to set a length for this. So because this is alphanumeric and it's a category, I should decide, well, what is a reasonable length for this field? The system's not going to let people enter data that is longer. 10 is probably too short for most things you want to do, but you probably also want it to set it to a limit. You're not encouraging people to put entire paragraphs in if it's free text. So once again, this is something you will probably want to design, maybe whiteboard it out what it is that you're trying to accomplish here. And for this one, the alphanumeric has a couple of substructures. So is this regular? Is it a text box, like a large text box? Is it address? Is it a telephone number? So it'll do some masking for that. Now, validation is important. So validation, do you want this to be something that people just key something into? If you are creating a user-defined field where it is something that you report on and you're expecting people to enter information that is consistent and repetitive, you're going to want to create validation for it. So that's going to force people to use this as a drop-down list rather than to enter information. And it all depends on what your purpose is. but if at all possible, do the validation, because it's difficult to report on information if people are going to introduce, inconsistencies like typing, spelling errors, or interpretation errors of the way the data should be put in. So for this one, we'll do some validation, and that validation could be go in a few different ways. I'm going to just show you the most simplest one. We'll come back and talk about this in a minute. So this is probably the most common. So in here, you would click the new button, and then you would set up the fields that you want in your drop-down list, and you would associate some indicator that goes in the system. This could be a number, this could be text. That's what's actually stored in the table. But you can always look up the description through your report writing. So if I wanted to do something like this, bronze, silver, and gold. And I can always come back later as an administrator and add to this list. But once again, keep in mind that once you start building up data, historical data in the system, changing this can be problematic. So the next important decision, do you want to have a default value for this field? Do you want the system to automatically decide that one of these is the default? So if I were to turn that on, you would tell the system, okay, which is the one that's the default? And that can be useful if most of your customers start out as bronze. Maybe you want to set this as the default. Another option that you have is to create a mandatory field. Now, if you decide to create a field that is mandatory, that means the system is going to enforce an entry. However, you have to consider if you are already live in the system, and I have hundreds or thousands of business partners already set up, I can't realistically make this field mandatory. You get this red bar at the bottom because the system doesn't know what to do with all of the customers that are already set up in the system. So if you do want to do this, you would have to set a default value, and then the system will retroactively go through your entire table structure, and it will set everything that already exists at that default, and then you would have to come in and change that information. And then any new business partners that you would put in, if you try to leave the field blank, it would bark at the user. So let's do this scenario. We'll add this table quickly. And this is where the system gives you a warning that it's about to update the table, and it can tell that there is a connection to the system, and this actually happens to be my connection. So I can effectively ignore this. Depending on if you're doing cloud server or internal server, you may get some indication of the user here, and you could let somebody know if it is after hours. If you choose to ignore, then the system will potentially bounce other users off the system. So our little dial is going to spin for 1 minute, and then we should get a brand new field created. So there we go. Now we have this user-defined field, and it is available in here, and we can come up back in the future and we can make updates to this. So let's slide this over to the side and have a look at what it is that we've done. So as I said before, this is a good thing to build in a test environment first, and then you can make sure that it's behaving the way that you want it to behave before you roll it out to production. And then after I create one, I like to come into the record right away and see how it looks. So if I go into my ad mode, you can see that the system is choosing the default that I said to be silver. So it's automatically populating that in, but I have the ability now to set it to whatever I want as I create a new record. If I go and search for records in the system, so let's bring up everybody. If I go to my form settings, we have our user-defined field, so category is available there. So in order to see it on this list, I just have to hit cancel and find again. And now I have that. So as I mentioned before, because I wanted this field to be mandatory, I had to set a default. So what Business One has done is it's gone through all of my records here, and it's updated every single business partner with the category of silver. If you are the kind of user that works more at the table level and you want to write a query or do something more sophisticated with this data, it is available to you on that table. So I'll just show you that quickly. If we go into queries and our query generator, and for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with this, if you want to know what table that is, click on the view and make sure that the system information is turned on. And then when I hover over this table, and I can't take my mouse down and show you, but if you look at the very bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you can see in tiny little text, it says form 134, tells me the item, the pane, the variable, and what I'm after is the very last bit of data, which is saying, right now you're hovering your mouse over the table OCRD, and the field is called card code. And if I move the mouse over slightly, this field is called card type and card name and so forth. And I can also hover it over my UDF, and you can see that it has given it a name too. It's called U_category. So I created this with the title of category. This is the field where you can't have any spaces or anything like that because the system wants a one-word name for that field, and it's going to append the letter U as in user and an underscore in front of that. So keep that in mind if you are querying this data. So I'm going to bring up my records for OCRD. Let me write a quick query. Let's bring in our business partner, our code name, and then go all the way to the bottom, and we can see there is our user-defined field. And as I mentioned before, what gets stored in there is not the word bronze or silver. What gets stored in there is the value that you set up. So if you used a numeric value that represents silver, like I have, it's 20. Or you could have maybe used an alpha like S, it's up to you. But you can write this query to check the user-defined data and bring in the actual data as well. So that's just a bit more sophisticated query writing. I won't show that today. So that's what's happening at the table level. Let's go in and just create a couple more so you can see other examples of data that we can create. So one thing to know, whenever you want to add a new field, you have to be highlighting the master data row, not one of the tables. If I am highlighting that table, the options I have here are to remove the data and update the data. If I hit update, you can see that it is not going to let me change that category field. It will let me update the description. It'll potentially make this, let me make this field longer if I don't have data that's disallows me to make it shorter. And then I can always come in here and I can create new values for my search. So you can make some limited updates to your user-defined fields once they've been rolled out. Okay, I'm going to go back up to my business partner. We're going to add another one, and let's create one called sales region. Oops. So we'll call this S region because, as I mentioned, that can't be spaces, and we're going to call this sales region. And we'll make this one alphanumeric, and we'll make it 30. And in this case, I'm not going to do a link to value. I'm going to leave it as none. But just to show you what some of these other ones are, so link to entities allows you to start getting more sophisticated and make your drop downs invoked on other system objects. So you can access other objects in the system to make them populate the value in this drop down. You could also associate it to a different table in the system, which this environment doesn't have, or a different user-defined object. So that's a bit more sophistication than I'm going to get into in detail today. If you do have questions about that, or that's where you want to go and you need assistance with that, please feel free to reach out to us. If you want to do validation on your rules, or sorry, if you want to do advanced, you can do some validation, meaning that maybe what I want to put in there is not a drop-down list, but I want to set up a little bit of intelligence. So maybe it's an identifier that I'm expecting the user to enter, and that identifier always has to start with the letter A. I could do something like that. If the person does not put in the right information there, then they would get an error. So when I'm doing this kind of information, I could make it mandatory. Sorry, once again, you can't really make it mandatory when you have historical data. So that would be a problem for you because you don't have anything to default into the field. So we'll add that one quickly. So once again, my warning about connections, I'm going to ignore that. I'm curious, is anybody in this session, is this the first time you're ever seeing user-defined fields, or have you worked with this before? I'm just sort of curious. If you want to let me know in the questions, feel free. Okay, so now I have two. I've got my category and my sales region. And I can do another example. Let's say there probably already is a salesperson field in the business partner, so this one doesn't totally make sense, but I just struggling for ideas at the moment. So I'm gonna make this one alphanumeric as well. And this one we won't put in any kind of validation at all. First time using this, okay, that's great. Okay, so now that I've set up a couple, let's go back into our business partner and let's just see how that behaves. So there we go, we've got our two. Let's go into a previous record in the system. And I'm just gonna update some of this information. So we'll change this person to gold. We'll put in a sales region here. Let's try putting in Calgary. And let's put in our salesperson is Norman. And when I hit update, I am gonna get an error because I have that validation rule. So I'm not sure you can make out that tiny little font there, but it is telling me something about the field does not start with the required value. And then it says should be an A. So if I go back into here and I change this to Alberta, then it allows me to save the record. So that gives you an idea for some of those different validations. So this gets pretty, can get fairly robust if you want to start tracking a lot of additional data. I would say that many of our clients use this, this feature very heavily, especially under business partners, if there's a lot of information that they're tracking. Another place is probably on the project module. So a lot of times clients are tracking a lot of additional information about the nature of a project. That is where there's maybe not fields already available. So the advantage to using user-defined fields is you have a lot of flexibility in what you want to create. In case of the disadvantages, I would say, well, one disadvantage is it's not connected to anything because it doesn't exist until you create it. So in order to really utilize that information, you're going to have to do the work to bring it into your reports or your queries or wherever it is that you want to do your analysis. So for example, you've got things like properties or business partner groups, you're limited by what these sort of features offer you. So properties, you can only rename 64 different properties. You can have an unlimited number of groups, but you can only have a customer belong to a single group. So the advantage to using these is you've already got all of the reporting out of the box, drives onto this information. So I think your first objective would be to try and see if the system already has a place to put that information that's logical, because it probably has some reporting that supports it. And if it simply doesn't, then this is a great alternative. Let's talk a little bit about the user-defined field categorization. Now with only 3 fields, this is very manageable. We do have some clients where they end up putting a ton of fields, like 20 or 30 fields on their business partner with information that they want to track, or maybe on their projects. And so sometimes it can be useful to maybe categorize those fields because maybe different people are going to care about them. So for this, and this is more back to your question about is this for you or for all the users? There is a way to kind of set this for all the users, but this is more like when you do this, you're kind of doing it for yourself. So if I go into the tools now, sorry, and I go into my, sorry, Sorry, my brain is just failing me now. Where do I go? Form, no, not form settings. Let me double check, maybe it's form settings. No, it's not form settings. Oh, user defined values, nope. Okay, I think it's under settings here. There we go, sorry about that. So that was tools, into the customization tools. It's a little bit buried here. And then I went to the settings. So remember that path, I just forgot it. But when you get into that settings, this is where you are sort of governing how you want things to appear in this panel. And it does let me create and customize categories here. So for example, I could create a new category, maybe called sales related fields. And then what I could do is I could specify certain ones of my UDF relate to this. So for example, let's say you're creating a whole bunch of user-defined fields. Some of them are used by the sales department and some of them are used by the finance department. And you want the ability to kind of let people sort them. Then you could come in here and say, okay, I just want to look at the sales-related fields. And so it hides that one other field. And then I can always change this back to all categories, and then I can get them all back. So that's just something cosmetic that you can do to manage your own interface. One other point, so if you do decide to remove a user-defined field, we can do that. So let's go down to our salesperson. Let's say, oh, I do realize there's actually a better place to store that. I'm just not very far into the process. And I'm gonna hit the remove button. And it tells you that this removal is irreversible. So meaning any data that is stored in here is going to be lost. So do keep that in mind. You want to be very careful with this. Hitting yes here gives me the same warning. People are connected. I'm going to say ignore. Now where I have had a record where I've set that information, I'm essentially deleting that off the server. There is no way to recover that. So this would be a fairly drastic thing to do, probably right after you've created it and maybe realized you did it incorrect and you want to take it off and try it again. If you're removing it and it does have data, I would just think carefully about what the implications of that are. Okay, so that was the master data. Let's look at the field level data, or rather that was the master data that really relates to the header level information. If we go to the marketing documents, we have the same ability to create information at the headers and at the rows. So if I want to create a user-defined field at the row, the way that looks in the system is going to be very different, but the way we create it is going to be very similar. So let's say we want to create some sort of a commission structure. So we'll call this commission credit. And we're going to create this. We'll do alphanumeric again. That's nice and easy. We'll just do 10, and we'll do some valid values. So click on your new button, and we'll just set up some quick regions here. We'll just call, say it's north and south. And I'm going to ignore, add this to the document. So by putting it in the rows, what I'm essentially deciding is the credit for these commissions, what I'm starting to build a foundation for, is for things that are built inside the particular rows of the document, meaning that I could set a different one for each row versus at the document level. And I'm not sure if this is still thinking. It looks like it's not responding, so we'll just give it a second and see. Some of these updates could take a minute or so on your server, depending how much data you have as well. And so once again, just a reminder that you should do this on off hours. Okay, so that took a little bit longer than the header, but it's completed. So let's go and check that out. So maybe I was thinking this really relates to when I sell something. So I'm going to go into an AR invoice. We'll select a customer, and we'll maybe select a product to sell. And we'll maybe select a second product to sell. And then where is my user defined field? It's not automatically installed into my screen, so you're going to have to do that as well. So go to your form settings, go to your table format, and then you're going to need to find that field. So it was commission credit. Chances are it's right at the very bottom. Oh yeah, it is actually on the screen. It was just at the very end. So I'm going to take it. This is a little bit finicky, but you can grab this field, hold on to it with your mouse button, your left button, and then just drag this up to kind of where you want it. So I'm going to put it up a little bit higher. That's probably about good. Maybe a little higher still. Okay, a lot of these fields are hidden, so moving it up here isn't really making a difference to anything. Put it right after our tax code. Okay, so now our field is there, and now you could assign that value at the row level. So once you've done this, and once it's been added to your employee screens, this just looks like any other field in the system. Now, if I had created this field at the title level, then you would have a field for the panel here. So we go Tools, we go View, activate your user-defined fields. I know there aren't any set up because I can see nothing under title. But once again, what is it you're trying to accomplish? In this case, my decision was I want to make sure I can set the flag for when I sell something at the different items, because I want the credit to go to the North region for this $500 and the South region for this one. So I plan to use the data this way versus setting it up here where maybe I want to set the data at the header level. So at this point, well, let's go ahead and add this document. We can save it to the system. But one thing, other thing I'll mention about the marketing documents is when you create this field, it is available in all of your marketing documents. And all of your marketing documents includes accounts payable and accounts receivable. So if I go in to do the AP purchase order, and I go down into my rows and we click on our form settings, that field is available in this document as well. So you have the option of hiding it if you're never going to use it for your payables side, but it is there. So keep that in mind. It may seem kind of strange, but in the case of a chain of documents, so a sales quote to a sales order to an AR invoice, if you set the data in that field and say your sales quote, it'll automatically promote the same field all the way through, and that's often beneficial to whatever business process you're following. And sometimes you may have a situation where you have, you're using the engine in the system to generate a purchase order directly from a sales quote or a sales document. And so it would also migrate that data across the chain into your purchasing documents as well. So that's why it uniformly creates that data inside all of the documents. You can just ignore it if you'll never happen to use it or hide it off the screen. So it really doesn't harm anything having it there. All right, so that's pretty much the fundamentals of creating it. Hopefully this kind of gets your mind churning on different ways that you might be able to use this in your system, or maybe go to your administrators if you don't have access to do that, to discuss what the data is. If this is something fairly complex, if you have the implications of a lot of legacy records where you need to get the data loaded into it, there are some features or functions we could do to help you with that. So feel free to reach out to us if there's anything that we could do to support you enhancing your system with user-defined fields. So with that, I think I'm done. Does anyone else have any other questions, comments, feedback? Was this a useful session for you, or anything that you'd like to see in future sessions? Okay, Kayla, I think we're a wrap for today. So thanks everybody.
Great, thanks Alex. So just a reminder, we have our next session on July 9th, tour of browser access with Business One. So we will see you then and have a great day. Today's Thursday.